Most people think helping others just drains your energy and resources. But what if I told you that one man's decision to save an abandoned baby completely transformed his entire life in ways he never imagined? This isn't just another feel-good story. This is about how a single act of kindness can flip your whole world upside down. Deep in a small village where everyone knew everyone else's business, two lives were about to collide in the most unexpected way. Neka was trapped in a nightmare marriage that was slowly killing her spirit. Meanwhile, Igor was a simple farmer who thought his biggest worry was planning his upcoming wedding. Neither of them knew that their paths would cross through the cries of a helpless baby left to die in the wilderness. What happened next would challenge everything they thought they knew about sacrifice, love, and the price of doing what's right. Neka's hands trembled as she pressed them against the mud walls of her small hut. The bruises on her arms had turned from purple to yellow, marking the day since Oka's last violent outburst. Her husband wasn't just cruel, he was becoming more dangerous with each passing week. The way he looked at her lately, like she was nothing more than property that had disappointed him, made her stomach twist with fear. She had tried to be the perfect wife. She cooked his meals exactly how his mother had taught her. She kept the house spotless despite having almost nothing to work with. She never talked back, never complained, never asked for anything. But nothing was ever good enough for Oka. When the neighbors' chickens got into their small garden, it was her fault for not watching them carefully enough. When the rains came late and damaged their crops, somehow that was her fault too. When she couldn't get pregnant fast enough, he blamed her for being useless as a woman. The irony was bitter now. She was finally pregnant, carrying the child Oka had demanded for so long. But instead of bringing joy, the pregnancy had made everything worse. Oka seemed to resent the baby before it was even born. He would stare at her growing belly with disgust and mutter about how much food and money a child would cost. Sometimes he would drink palm wine until his eyes became bloodshot and then press his hands hard against her stomach, asking if she was sure the baby was even his. The night her labor pains started, Oka wasn't even home. He had gone to the next village to drink with his friends, leaving her alone in the darkness with nothing but a flickering oil lamp and her own terror. The pain came in waves that seemed to tear her body apart from the inside. She bit down on a piece of cloth to keep from screaming, knowing that even in her agony, the neighbors would judge her for making too much noise. When baby Ede finally arrived just before dawn, Neka felt a mixture of relief and overwhelming dread. The tiny girl was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a strong cry that filled the silent hut. But as Neka held her daughter for the first time, all she could think about was what kind of life awaited this innocent child. Would Oka hit her the way he hit Neka? Would he scream at her and call her worthless? Would he blame this beautiful baby for every problem in their lives? Oka returned home 3 days later, reeking of alcohol and barely able to walk straight. When he saw the baby, his face twisted into the same expression he wore when he looked at spoiled food. He didn't ask if Neka was okay. He didn't ask about the birth or whether they needed anything. He just stared at Ada with cold eyes and asked how much milk and porridge the baby would need each day. Over the next 2 weeks, Oka's behavior became even more erratic. He would disappear for days without explanation, leaving Neka with no money for food. When he was home, he complained constantly about the baby's crying, even when Ada was being perfectly quiet. He started talking about how life was better before, when it was just the two of them and he didn't have to worry about feeding extra mouths. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday morning. Neka had been up all night with Ada, who was running a slight fever. She was exhausted, hungry, and worried sick about her daughter. When Oka woke up and found that she hadn't prepared his breakfast yet, he exploded into a rage unlike anything she had ever seen before. He grabbed her by the hair and dragged her across the floor, screaming about how useless she had become since the baby arrived. He kicked over the small pot where she had been warming water for Ada's bath. He threw their few dishes against the wall, shattering them into pieces. And then, in a moment that would replay in Neko's mind forever, he looked at baby Ada lying on the mat and said the words that made her blood run cold. Maybe we would all be better off if that thing had never been born. That night, after Oka had stormed out again, Neka sat in the darkness holding her sleeping daughter. Ada's tiny fingers were wrapped around Neko's thumb, trusting and innocent. The baby had no idea that her own father saw her as a burden, as something to be gotten rid of. Neka kissed Ada's forehead and made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She couldn't protect her daughter from Oka. She had no money, no family to turn to, nowhere to run. But maybe, just maybe, someone else could give Ada the life she deserved. Someone who would see her as a blessing instead of a curse. Someone who would love her and keep her safe. The next morning, while Oka was still sleeping off his latest drinking session, Neko wrapped Ada in the softest cloth she owned, a wrapper that had belonged to her own mother. She packed a small bag with the few baby clothes she had managed to make and what little food she could carry. Her hands shook as she wrote a simple note and pinned it to Ada's blanket. Please take care of my daughter. Give her the love I cannot protect her to receive. The walk to the edge of the village felt like the longest journey of her life. Every step took her further away from the only home Ada had ever known, but closer to what Neko hoped would be safety. She chose a spot near the main path where someone was likely to find the baby quickly, but hidden enough that Ada would be protected from the sun and rain until help arrived. As she placed Ada on the soft grass beneath a large tree, the baby opened her eyes and looked directly at her mother. Those innocent eyes seemed to ask why she was being left behind, and Neko felt her heart shatter into a million pieces. She kissed Ada's cheek one last time, whispered a prayer for her safety, and forced herself to walk away without looking back. What Neko didn't know was that her desperate act of love was about to change not just Ada's life, but the life of a kind-hearted farmer who was walking that same path just a few hours later.
Ego wiped the sweat from his forehead as he adjusted the heavy bag of yam seedlings on his shoulder. The morning sun was already getting hot, and he still had a long walk ahead of him to reach his farm on the other side of the village. At 28 years old, he had walked this same route hundreds of times, but today felt different somehow. Maybe it was because his wedding to Enia was only 3 months away, or maybe it was just the excitement of starting a new planting season. He had been planning this marriage for over 2 years now. Enia was considered one of the most beautiful women in their village and the surrounding areas. Her father owned several plots of good farmland and a small shop that sold cloth and household items. Everyone said Ego was lucky to win her hand in marriage, especially since he came from a much more modest background. His own parents had died when he was barely 20, leaving him with just a small piece of land and the knowledge of farming they had passed down to him. But Ego had worked hard to prove himself worthy of Enia's family. He had expanded his farm bit by bit, saved every penny he could, and built a reputation as one of the most reliable and honest young men in the village. When he asked for Enia's hand in marriage, her father had been impressed by his dedication and work ethic. The bride price had been steep, but Ego had managed to pay it by selling his best harvest and borrowing a small amount from his uncle. Now, as he walked along the familiar dirt path, Ego was thinking about all the improvements he wanted to make to his house before Enia moved in. She had made it clear that she expected certain standards: a proper kitchen, a well-built roof that wouldn't leak during the rainy season, and furniture that was suitable for a woman of her social status. Ego didn't mind the pressure. He loved Enia, and he wanted to give her everything she deserved. The path curved around a large Iroko tree that had been there for as long as anyone could remember. Local children often played in its shade, and travelers would rest there during the hottest part of the day. As Ego approached the tree, he heard something that made him stop dead in his tracks. It was a sound that seemed completely out of place in the early morning stillness, the weak, desperate cry of a baby. Ego set down his bag and listened carefully. The crying was definitely coming from somewhere near the tree, but he couldn't see anyone around. He walked closer, following the sound, and that's when he spotted something that made his heart skip a beat. There, lying on a small cloth beneath the tree's massive roots, was a tiny baby girl. The infant was wrapped in a faded but clean wrapper, and she was crying with the kind of urgency that suggested she had been there for a while. Ego looked around frantically, expecting to see the baby's mother somewhere nearby, perhaps gathering firewood or water. But the area was completely empty except for the two of them. He knelt down beside the baby and gently touched her tiny hand. She was warm, which was a good sign, but her cries were getting weaker. Pinned to her blanket was a small piece of paper with writing on it. Ego could read, unlike many people in his village, thanks to an old teacher who had lived there when he was a child. Please take care of my daughter. Give her the love I cannot protect her to receive. The words hit Ego like a physical blow. Someone had deliberately left this baby here, hoping that a kind stranger would find her and take her in. As he read the note again, he could almost feel the desperation and heartbreak of whoever had written it. This wasn't abandonment born of cruelty, this was the act of someone who loved this child so much that they were willing to give her up to save her. Ego picked up the baby carefully, surprised by how light she felt in his arms. She stopped crying almost immediately, as if she sensed that help had finally arrived. Her eyes were bright and alert, and when she looked at him, Ego felt something shift inside his chest. This wasn't just any baby, this was a child who needed him, who had been placed directly in his path for a reason. But as the initial shock wore off, the reality of the situation began to sink in. What was he supposed to do with a baby? He was a single man with no experience caring for infants. His wedding was in 3 months, and he had been focused entirely on preparing for his new life with Enia. How could he possibly explain this to her? How could he explain it to anyone? Ego looked down at the baby again. She had fallen asleep in his arms, her tiny fist curled around his finger. Despite all his worries and questions, he knew he couldn't just leave her there. Whatever problems this might cause, he couldn't walk away from a helpless child who needed his help. He gathered up the cloth and the note, then carefully secured the baby against his chest using part of his own wrapper. The yam seedlings would have to wait for another day. Right now, he had a much more urgent responsibility to deal with. The walk back to his house seemed to take forever. With each step, Ego's mind raced with questions and concerns. What would he feed the baby? Where would she sleep? How would he explain her sudden appearance to his neighbors? And most importantly, what would Enia think when she found out? By the time he reached his small compound, word had already begun to spread. In a village where everyone knew everyone else's business, the sight of bachelor Ego carrying a baby was bound to attract attention. His neighbor, an elderly woman named Mama Kemi, was the first to approach him. Ego, whose baby is that? She asked, her eyes wide with curiosity and concern. I found her abandoned by the old Iroko tree, Ego replied honestly. Someone left her there with a note asking for help. Mama Kemi's expression softened immediately. She had raised 7 children of her own and had helped deliver countless babies in the village over the years. Bring her inside, she said without hesitation. Let me look at her properly. Inside Ego's small hut, Mama Kemi examined the baby with practiced hands. She's healthy, she announced after a few minutes. Maybe 2 or 3 weeks old. She needs milk and she needs it soon. Do you have any idea who the mother might be? Ego shook his head. The handwriting on the note hadn't looked familiar, and he couldn't think of any woman in the village who had recently given birth and then disappeared. What should I do? He asked. Mama Kemi looked at him with a mixture of admiration and concern. That depends on what kind of man you want to be, she said quietly. You could take her to the village chief and let him decide what to do with her. Or you could take responsibility for her yourself. But I'll warn you, if you choose to keep her, your life is going to change in ways you can't even imagine. Before Ego could respond, they heard voices outside. Through the small window, he could see a group of villagers gathering in front of his house. News traveled fast in their community, and apparently everyone had heard about the mysterious baby by now. Ego, called out Boba Tond, one of the village elders. Come out here and explain what's going on. Ego took a deep breath and stepped outside, still carrying the baby. The crowd that had gathered was larger than he had expected, at least 15 people, including some of the most respected members of the community. But as his eyes scanned the faces, he noticed that Enya was standing at the back of the group, her expression unreadable. "I found this baby abandoned by the Iroko tree this morning," Igo announced, his voice steady despite the nervous flutter in his stomach. "Someone left her there with a note asking for help. I couldn't just leave her to die." The crowd murmured among themselves, some nodding in approval while others looked skeptical. Enya pushed through the group until she was standing directly in front of Igo. Her beautiful face was set in hard lines, and her eyes were colder than he had ever seen them. "And what exactly do you plan to do with her?" Enya asked, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. Igo looked down at the sleeping baby in his arms, then back at his fiancée. In that moment, he realized that his answer would determine not just the baby's future, but his own as well. The weight of the decision pressed down on him like a heavy stone, but somehow, looking at the innocent child who had been placed in his care, the choice felt surprisingly clear. "I'm going to take care of her," he said simply. "This baby needs someone to love her and protect her. If no one else will do it, then I will." The silence that followed his words seemed to stretch on forever. Enya's face went through a series of expressions: shock, anger, disbelief, and finally, cold determination. When she spoke again, her voice was quiet but everyone could hear the finality in it. "Then you'll have to choose between her and me. I won't marry a man who brings someone else's bastard child into our home."